Now, if you don't have existing data, you may have to capture the data yourself. And this is, you may want to convert data that's in some type of digital format that's maybe not necessarily GIS, or maybe it comes from something like remote sensing data that's in a spatial format but was developed outside of GIS. Not yet GIS data could include, raw GPS data or spreadsheets or what have you. Spatial data can include remote sensing imagery, maybe things that are captured by satellite, but they weren't produced in a GIS, but they can easily be brought into a GIS. And sometimes if it's hard times, you might have to convert non-digital data. And this means actually tracing maps one way or the other using either scanned copies of the maps or some type of special equipment that allow you to trace boundaries. And another last part of data capture, oftentimes it's a good idea if before you invest too much resources in what you're doing is to maybe start with a small area and do a pilot project, maybe just kind of a little test run for a subset, an area maybe that you're familiar with, go through your whole kind of plan process, see if it works out. And that way, if there is a real problem with either your database design or your project design or your assumptions about how good the data is going to work, it's better to find out before you spend too much time. All right, digital data. This can include survey equipment. We see people, with new construction with different equipment for surveying lines. Photogrammetry is another one. This is where people take aerial photography and are able to derive different measurements. This is a GPS. GPS receivers collect latitude and longitude that can be imported into GIS. You can have spreadsheets that include X and Y coordinates, or even sometimes addresses that can be then converted into, or what we call geocoded into locations. Also, this includes remote sensing imagery. We'll have a whole different lecture on remote sensing later in the semester, but essentially this is raster data that's collected from a distance by satellites or aircraft or drones. It is oftentimes imagery, but this can also include things like LiDAR data or radar data, various types of things that have been created by sensors and then created into some product that you can import into GIS. Now, when it comes to non-digital data, the classic example is hard copy maps. If you have, say, a map that was, created sometime in the, in the past, no one ever converted, there's no digital or GIS copy of the information in the map. It could be maybe a map from 100 years ago, let's say. You could digitize the information from the maps. A couple of ways to go it. You can scan maps, and if you scan it, you can align the scanned information to a background map. And so here, these are maybe some old aerial photographs that have been scanned and aligned to the GIS. And then once that's done, you can trace boundaries of things from that image in the GIS. You can do this as well with maps. This is called heads-up digitizing, where you're actually doing heads up, meaning that you're looking at the GIS screen while you're doing it using a mouse. And back in the old days, and this is less common now, but what we used to do often is use what are called digitizing boards. And these are big kind of boards that people would tape a map to, and they would set control points, which would align it with your GIS, and they would actually trace the information using a special device on the board. Less common now. I don't think it's been a while since I've seen someone actually doing that. Oftentimes now we'll scan it and then do the heads up GIS. And lastly, you can actually just trace features in the field using a GPS unit. You can have a GPS, and you could actually walk around some type of a feature and be collecting the actual GIS points using your GPS in the field.